in community, in education, and in politics, on campus, and across the world. Christ in everything. You're listening to Cedar 60.
Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Mays and welcome to episode 2 of Cedar 60. We are excited for this week's interview with Dr. Marc Clauson of Cedarville University on the Supreme Court and the Christian's role in the judiciary. But before we get to the interview, here is a brief recap of 3 important developments from the news this week. First in the news was the coronavirus. Dozens of COVID-19 vaccines are under development across the world. According to a report this week, however, inhaled vaccines might be more effective than the traditional injection. Scientists believe that an inhaled vaccine could be far more effective than an injection because the respiratory system may activate the body's immune system's response faster than a traditional injected vaccine. Also, United States health regulators paused Eli Lilly's coronavirus antibody treatment trials out of, quote, a abundance of caution, but no other information as to why this treatment was paused has been given at this time. The decision comes after Johnson & Johnson paused their own COVID-19 treatment trials last week after an unexplained illness presented itself in one of their own trial patients. And second, on a more lighthearted note, President Trump and Joe Biden did not debate each other this week, but the bad news is they held separate televised town halls at the same time. President Trump appeared on NBC while Vice President Biden appeared on ABC. Unfortunately, instead of Americans being able to see the candidates' opinions on the issues that matter to them, the events were more about the ratings and which candidate could draw a larger TV audience. And finally, this week, the Senate Judiciary Committee held hearings for its recommendation on Supreme Court Justice nominee Judge Amy Coney Barrett. As will be discussed in this week's interview, many controversial issues were discussed in the hearings, among which were the fate of Roe v. Wade and the fate of the Affordable Care Act. Judge Barrett wisely refused to answer whether or not she would recuse herself from the president if there were a Bush-Gore scenario in the election come November 3rd, by quoting the Ginsburg rule, which, quote, gives no hints, no forecasts, and no previews to such legal questions in such a hearing. And now, here is Johnny Gartner with this week's interview. Thank you, and have a great week.
Hello there. Welcome back to Cedar 60. My name is Johnny Gartner, and joining me today is Dr. Marc Clauson. Dr. Clauson is a professor of history and law here at Cedarville University, and he holds, among many degrees, a PhD in history from the University of the Orange Free State in South Africa and a JD from the West Virginia University College of Law. Dr. Clauson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so this week, the main news in the political arena has been the confirmation process of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Can you provide just a little bit of background about the confirmation process in general, how it works, and maybe talk about some of the precedents that have been brought up and why this one is kind of unusual?
Sure. The Constitution says that in cases of vacancy on the federal courts, in the case of the Constitution, it just means the Supreme Court at that time. But where there is a vacancy, the president will appoint or nominate, I should say, a candidate to fill that vacancy. And then the Senate will advise and consent to that nomination, confirm that nomination. It doesn't specify whether there has to be a majority vote or a filibuster is possible. It just says confirm, that's all. So it's kind of open there. We've had discussions about that throughout time. It also doesn't say anything about how close to the election it has to be, just whenever a vacancy occurs, gives the president that right, that authority to do that. So this is not unusual in that sense. We've had nominations before close to elections, and we've had nominations also by parties opposite to the party of the Senate right?
Right.
So that's not uncommon either. So we can get that out of the way right away. Once it's done, once it's in the Senate for confirmation, then there's no particular procedure that has to be adopted. The Constitution doesn't specify how you go about that, it just specifies the final vote has to be something over a majority. It may be more than a simple majority, but at least majority. So right now it's going to the committee, to a committee of 22, and they've been holding hearings for the past 3 days. Each senator gets to ask questions of the nominee, which they've been doing, and they alternate between Democrats, Republicans, and they're finishing up today with witnesses. So I just finished listening, in fact, to the last of the witnesses who were either supporting or opposing Amy Coney Barrett. And so that's kind of how it works. It'll be reported out of committee, voted out of committee. It'll most certainly be voted in her favor by a majority of this committee. And it will go to the whole Senate, and they'll vote likely next week around the 15th.
Perfect. You mentioned it'll be voted out of committee. Can you talk maybe just a little bit about what they've been talking about in the committee, the kinds of questions they've been asking her? I think there's been kind of a disagreement about interpretation of the Constitution, in her interpretation of the Constitution. And, there's this whole big argument about the Affordable Care Act and all of that. So could you just kind of talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah, actually, they got into the weeds a lot more than they did the last Kavanaugh nomination, which is kind of interesting. But on the one side, the pro Amy Coney Barrett side has been talking about how she interprets the Constitution as an originalist. And by that, she means what was the original public meaning of the text itself at the time it was written or ratified. And then the Democratic side has tended to focus on certain particular cases that may come before her, such as abortion cases, the Affordable Care Act, which is coming before them in another few days. November the 10th is going to be argued in the Supreme Court, and trying to discover how she might actually rule in a case like that. And she has responded in those cases typically by stating that she is unable to answer those because she may be a judge in the case, and by trying to give an opinion ahead of time, she would be violating the canons of judicial ethics by trying to give an opinion on a case before it has actually come before the court. And this has been a back and forth between the different members of the committee, the senators in the committee, through the whole week until today. So that's kind of what's going on. They've varied a lot on the kinds of issues they've tried to focus in on. It's been typically, though, healthcare, abortion, gun rights. Those have been the big three that they've focused on with her.
Yeah, so could you actually just talk a little bit about each of those topics, just so we kind of get an understanding about what maybe is at stake if she does get confirmed, what Democrats are saying will happen if she gets confirmed, what Republicans are saying. So I guess we could start with the Affordable Care Act. Is there an argument that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, or is they worrying that she's going to legislate in her views and her decisions? Just kind of talk about that.
Sure. As a judicial case, there is an argument that it may be unconstitutional. But as she herself stated in an indirect way, it is possible that even though the act, at least part of the act may be unconstitutional, it can be that part that's unconstitutional can be separated out or severed from the whole act. And therefore the whole act besides that provision can be preserved, and that provision can be declared unconstitutional. Others, on the other hand, will argue that you can't really do that you can't sever it and then hold part of it unconstitutional, the rest of it valid. It has to either sink or fall completely. We know already that severability is possible. The courts have been discussing that extensively in recent years. The question is, would they do it? We don't know in a given case ahead of time whether they would do it. The argument for her particularly will be, and the court itself, since the part of the act that the mandate part, the tax part, the penalty part, right, that was part of the act, since that was declared unconstitutional by the lower court, does that render the whole act unconstitutional? Because the whole thing sinks or swims on that. Or is it possible just to cut it off and say the rest of it still stands? That's the particular issue they've been trying to wrestle with her, trying to get some idea of how she might rule. And of course, she stated, I can't tell you. I don't know yet because it's a real case coming up and I have to see all the facts and not just part of the facts. So
Right.
That's what's going on with that right now.
And of course, it's muddied by the fact that President Trump has said in the past he would nominate someone who would completely remove the Affordable Care Act, correct?
Right. He said that, and yet she's tried to distance herself from that,
Right.
Which is wise of her to do that. And in fact, I tend to believe she is open to the possibility of keeping part of an act if it's possible to keep it. She kept making this argument, it was a valid argument, that if it's possible to keep the rest of an act and just declare part of it unconstitutional, then the court would tend to do it, and she would too.
Okay.
But if it's not, well, it has to go. So, and for her, it's a matter of law. It's not a matter of whether the thing is good or bad. It's a matter of what the law says in light of the Constitution.
Right. I think another thing that Democrats especially have been bringing into focus in this process was the fact that she's Catholic and how that would affect her ruling on Roe versus Wade if it was ever brought back on the court, and the issue of abortion in general. So could you just touch on what the major talking points on that topic are as well?
Sure. They were actually pushing her harder on that. They believed that she would try to overturn Roe versus Wade because she has expressed an opinion some years ago and signed a statement that was anti-abortion some years ago, not as a judge, but as an individual citizen on one occasion and as an academic on another occasion. But in that case, the Roe versus Wade case, it's very much more complex than that. Roe versus Wade itself has been modified over the years. That case is precedent, but as she herself said, not super precedent because it's still live. There's still issues coming before the court on abortion. In fact, there have been about 7 to 8 cases coming before the court in the last year or so. So being the fact it's a live issue, she can't give any opinion on it. And she shouldn't, right, which is the correct thing to do. But the whole issue will turn on probably not whether Roe versus Wade will be overturned completely. That's not likely, but rather how much it will be restricted by a court in the future, which would include her. And her Catholic faith is being used in order to criticize her and think that she's going to somehow restrict abortion even more than it is already, particularly notification laws, partial birth abortion bans, things like that are coming up before the court and have come up before the court very recently. Right. So that's another issue in which she's been pressed on her religious views. Now, again, I think she's been very clear. She's been very clear that she can separate her religious views from the law itself. No matter what her religious views might be, if the Constitution does not allow her, if she believes it does not allow her to overturn any part of an abortion law, then she'll go that way. If she believes it does allow her to do that, she'll go that way, right? But she's looking primarily at the law itself through the lens of the Constitution.
Right. So I suppose the main question that I kind of want to focus on at the end of all of this is obviously on November 3rd, the election will happen and the president obviously gets the choice to nominate Supreme Court justice. And we're seeing the kinds of justices that Trump would, nominate. We've seen the kinds of justices he would appoint. As Christians, what should our response to be in elections specifically to these issues? Because abortion is obviously a very important issue to the church. How do we respond, not maybe in a sense of who we vote for, although that is a very important issue, but how do we respond to this whole argument and how do we take that in light of the election?
These issues, I guess, what you're referring to, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious to almost all Christians that abortion presents a real problem, right? It violates the law that would state the Mosaic Law and the 10 Commandments, that the taking of a life, an unlawful taking of a life, is a sin, as well as it could be a public offense for somebody like an abortion provider. The problem comes for Christians, and this is a conscience issue, I have to admit, is do they have any limits to that opposition to abortion? Is it possible that a Christian, you could still be a Christian and say support abortion in the case of incest or abuse or something like this? And I think at that point, although a Christian would most likely tend to favor a blanket prohibition of abortion, some Christians will take the position that those are exceptions, right? I understand that even if I don't agree with it. And I think at that point, I have to allow some grace for the conscience issue there. Although I would not agree with that. I would tend to think it's a blanket issue, and we could find homes for those children born out of incest or abuse or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But still, I understand that reasonable Christians at the margins can disagree with that. And to the extent we're not required to abort babies, we don't have to participate in that either, which is good. So even though it's permitted because of the Supreme Court reading the Constitution in a particular way, we don't have to participate in that. We're not required to. Hopefully we never would be required to be complicit in that. Some people are, though, right? There are health providers who have a conscience issue with that, being required to take the life of an unborn child. And that's a legal issue that hasn't come to the Supreme Court yet. It's in the lower courts right now. It will come. And the question is, will they be allowed to exercise their conscience rights individually in cases like that? I think they probably will, but it's going to have to take a Supreme Court to resolve that, I think.
Right. And in terms of how Christians can positively impact this, obviously voting is the number one way to affect the judiciary, because by voting for presidents who nominate the kinds of judges that we would like to see. But do you see any other ways to get involved with the decisions that the judiciary make, and especially with the legislature on issues like these?
Yeah, I think one thing, of course, obviously we can lobby our legislative bodies, states, Congress, and that's a political move. And we have to make a calculation of just how much stock we put in politics in doing that. I think there are other alternatives that we often tend to forget, though, as Christians, and that is to be faithful in proclaiming the gospel, get out there and proclaim it everywhere we are, and people come to Christ, and then they begin to see these things, right, that they didn't see before. And the other thing we can do is action in actually adopting babies and creating institutions that will adopt them and facilitate adoptions, and do everything we can to make it more palatable for a woman who's pregnant and wants an abortion not to get the abortion, right? We can do that as the church. And I think that's another alternative that we sometimes forget. Yes, abortion's harder today in the United States than it has been in the past, but we can still do it. And I've seen lots of friends do it, and I've seen lots of people who I didn't know do it out there. So those are other alternatives besides just the political process.
Yeah. I'm adopted, and I had a professor. Are you really?
Yes.
That is so cool. I had a professor or a class in high school. Was a college level class that I was taking dual enrollment, and the professor one day was talking, and he said, perhaps the greatest argument for abortion is that it keeps kids out of foster care. And it strikes me that especially people like us as actually adopted people, and then as Christians who are adopted into the body of Christ, we have a special opportunity to say that because we're adopted, we know what it means to be adopted, and you can still be adopted and still be loved, and you don't need to abort your child because someone else can love them.
Yeah.
I don't think the church has done a good job of proclaiming that. Would you agree?
I would definitely agree with that. We talk about it a lot. We talk about the evils of abortion, but we don't put feet to our actions. And there are a lot of creative things we can do out there that can be done without the political process even. We don't even need the political process to do these things. We just need compassion, right? That's all, which is free.
Yeah. So I guess in conclusion, going back to the Supreme Court and kind of the impact it has on all of this, in terms of who wins this election, what's the future of the Supreme Court? I've heard some people say that it's possible that if Trump wins, another justice could die and he would appoint another conservative justice, and that might do damage to the Supreme Court. Do you see that being a bad thing? Do Do you see a liberal response being to just stock it full of or liberal judges once they get the chance? Do you see court packing as something that could happen? Just your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, the court packing issue has been in the news a lot lately. President Franklin Roosevelt tried it in the 1930s. Congress slapped him down on that. Even though the Congress was Democratic, they knew then that that might not be a good idea. It kind of starts a chain reaction of never-ending additions to the court, and you could end up with this. I don't know. I think of Star Wars, where you have the what was it? The assembly. I don't know what they called that.
The
In
Senate.
Star Wars movies. What was it?
The Senate.
The Senate. Yes, the Senate was this massive body of 1,000 people or something, 2,000 people. I can just envision a court with 1,000 judges on it, right? That's where that could lead, and it's an escalation of that. I don't think either party would be wise to pursue that path, and I think they probably wouldn't, even though Congress could do it. The Constitution doesn't prohibit them from doing that. They could add members if they get both houses to agree. As for other issues, the election could impact the future judges. Obviously, I could see retirements by people like Thomas, for example. I don't know about some of the other ones, but Thomas is a pretty good candidate. He's in his 70s. If that happened, Trump would obviously, if he were president, he'd obviously appoint a conservative judge. But I'm not sure that the judges that Trump would appoint are going to be radical as some people think they are. If you look at Amy Coney Barrett, for example, she doesn't seem like a radical. Seems like a very bright, thoughtful originalist, which may lead her in many cases to what's considered a conservative decision, but in other cases to what might not be considered conservative, right? She's following the Constitution. And that's probably likely what you're going to get with the future appointee or nominees to the Supreme Court, which is fine. I think that's a good thing. I think originalism, hopefully, is the wave of the future here. Not to say there's no role for precedent, to looking back at cases from the past that are important, but there has to be a time where you reconsider any possible case in the past. That has to come sometime, right? You can't just accept it because it's there. And that's that whole tension between precedent and originalism that comes up, which can't be solved here with our podcast. But it's a big deal. But I think you're not going to see any radical judges at all. But I think you're going to see thoughtful judges. The list I've seen, the various lists I've seen, consist of really qualified people who are not out there in outer space.
Yeah. And then I suppose as a final thought, as Christian college students who are just entering careers, and have a lifetime of listening and watching politics and watching judges get appointed, what would be your suggestion on ways to get involved in affecting the decisions that they make, the people that get appointed, and how we can make effective change in policy and in law? Yeah,
probably the best way to do that. This is a difficult one because judges are kind of insulated from the process. You don't have to know a president to have an effect, though. It would help, but you don't have to. What you really should start doing, though, is look at the state level of politics and be engaged in who your senators and congressmen are, particularly your senators, who pay attention to who they are and what they stand for, because they're going to be the ones that are going to vote to confirm any Supreme Court justice. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is that although the Supreme Court has become increasingly important, it's still not the only branch of government. And we have to consider it doesn't make every decision, nor should it. And we have to be careful of everybody else too. But if you're going to have an effect on Supreme Court nominees, the best place to do it is through your senators at the state level. You can lobby them, you can write them, you can campaign for the ones you really favor. Those kinds of things are very important. And you don't have to go to the federal level to do that. Just stay at the state level.
Yeah. And thank the Lord that God is still sovereign, right?
That's right. In the end, this will all pass. And as much as God appointed temporal government for our good, and he did do that, he appointed them, still in all, we have to look to the Lord for ultimately everything. Yeah. And government won't save us.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dr. Clauson, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate having you on. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for listening to Cedar 60. Until next time, have a great day.